Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show in Ohio, curated by Shar Norman. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Jenniffer Omaitz. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions. We'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Jenniffer.
Thank you. I want to thank Kat Sheridan and all of the staff at the Rife Gallery for this amazing opportunity. And I also want to thank the curator, Shar Norman, for putting together in Ohio. I'm very honored to be part of this awesome exhibition. So I'm going to dive in and talk about my work, some of the process, some of the influences, some of the informative stuff that happens in the studio. And my practice really starts a lot with drawing as a way of investigating, researching, defining. Um, Over the course of the last 18 years, I've also taught drawing, design, variations of painting, art history classes, and all of that really kind of joins and sticks to the work in various ways. But it's a huge influence. It's a huge part of my practice that I keep on coming back to whenever I'm stuck. Research and influences, this has been a cumulative over the course of my practice over, I don't know, 23 years now, 24 years, something like that. It's been a while. I'm heavily influenced by architecture, modular structures, deconstructivist architects, experimental cinema, specifically that of Stan Brakhage, Len Line, Norma McLaren, Kasumi, our Cleveland's own Kasumi, and Paul Clipson. I'm really interested in graphic design history and some of the founders of modern day practice, Bradbury Thompson, Wolfgang Weingart, Carl Gershner, Paul Rand, and Max Bill. A book that really heavily influenced me when I was an undergrad, and I still come back to from time to time, The Daily Practice of Painting, Notes and Interviews and Musings by Gerhard Richter. Richter, to me, is an amazing painter, and I've always enjoyed his work, but always enjoyed his process and his struggle and where it's come from. And again, this has been a book as a kind of a guide to studio practice and a heartbeat of things that I come back to. Other influential books on painters, installation artists that are actually on the shelf behind me I have a library here in my office, and my office is also shared with some of my other practices that are bookbinding and DJing, which you'll find out about shortly. But, you know, architects, installation artists, cross-platform artists like Judy Pfaff or William Kentridge, and definitely the work of Julian Mauretu, Matthew Ritchie, Albert Olin, just to name a few, have been very influential to giving me permissions that I otherwise wouldn't have. Um, I've been interested in film along with these practices, but you know, again, going back to experimental cinema, when I graduated from undergrad, I made a 35 millimeter film that was all hand etched and bleached. And you're looking at two stills from one of the films that I did, but I'm interested in working in this like micro and macro kind of cosmos way. But I'm interested in the way that light, space, and time can influence artwork, can influence mood, atmosphere. And I thought that when I graduated from CIA's, where I went for undergrad, I was going to go to UCLA or Cal Arts and, you know, get my grad degree in film, and that wasn't the case. But I was fascinated with the practice. Some of my other influences, Kurt Schwitters. This is a well-known piece, of course, Merzbau from 1933. This is a shot of the installation in his home. but the idea of studio space and becoming a participant in the work, uh, having a cathedral of collections and exotic scraps. Um, to me, this was the beginning of site specificity, and I view Schwitters as the grandfather of installation art, modern day installation art. This is an installation that I did, again, as an influence. Schwitters was an influence, but this is something that I did that's kind of akin to some site-specific work that I was investigating in grad school. Um, this, for me, brings up a couple of different things. Uh, Chinese shadow puppetry is a kind of a form of theater that's acted by silhouettes or figures made from leather or paper, accompanied by music or singing. There's no singing, there's no music in this, but um, it was also preliminary to magic lantern shows, and I thought that that was just a beautiful play on light and space. And I realized during grad school that I could activate this shadow play and the sense of theater with the shadows themselves and specific lighting techniques, but I'm going to go back and forth in this in a second. And you could see that some of the shadows influence the drawing on the wall. So there's kind of an amplification when light becomes part of this theater. Other influences of mine come from architects. This is Micro Megas, a series that has blankets of forms and shapes. These are from Daniel Libeskind's early architectural drawings. They're about unfolding future possibilities in relationship to history or history of one's own architectural drawing. When I was a young artist living in Denver, Colorado, circa 2005, 2006, I had the pleasure of seeing this entire collection with the gallery that I was showing at, Sandy Carson Gallery. And the director at the time brought me into the back room and showed me the work because they were also going to feature Daniel Libeskind, who was at that time creating the new version of the Denver Art Museum on 13th Street. And of course, I could look out on my balcony and see this thing that kind of looked like a ship hall being created over 13th. And I was fascinated by the architecture, but I was blown away by some of these works. And I found that this gave me new permissions in drawing, new permissions in how to deal with composition and space, dealing with complexity, and kind of taking a system that was very labor intensive, that dealt with site section, plan, and everything, and just compress it all at once. And of course, another influence that comes out of this directly is the artist Julie Maritou. And she kind of does the same thing with her work, but activates different rationales. So thinking about micro megas and thinking about kind of where I am in my current assemblage practice, this is a piece that I exhibited at Alliance at Mount Union University a couple of years ago. And I think that there's pieces and parts of maybe some of my influences coming out in this, but definitely I'm thinking about altering sections and plans and views and scales to the extent that definitely lends a hand or gives a high five to some of the architectural works that I've been inspired by. One of the other things that's a hallmark of my work is I DJ in my spare time. It's my hobby, something that I've practiced for over a decade. It's only been in the last year that I've started playing live sets, but I'm really interested in this connection to DJing as a form of, or as a connection to painting. A DJ uses pitch, cue, filters, fade, and other time effects to create auditory landscapes. And it's completely abstract, and I see DJs kind of as modern day collage artists. They're collaging sound and time, and that's their primary medium. So I see there being a nice kind of parallel between maybe what collage artists and painters can do in the studio and the sound practice. Also giving you a little bit of background where I'm coming from as a painter, not just an installation artist or somebody that deals with space, is a few years after graduating from CIA and undergrad, I started making these paintings that were oil on canvas, and they were either in diptychs or grids, but they were based off of a lot of long exposure photography. So I was using the camera at that time and re-rigging a 35 millimeter SLR camera so that I would get this super long exposure. And I would take pieces and parts of this maybe 35 millimeter film reel that I could just select pieces and parts of it, but all of it was one continuous image. So I was interested in distilling time and light and space. So this is a recurring theme in my work. This particular piece is on permanent view at the Colorado Symphony Orchestra, which I was very happy to be a part of a solo show long ago. And here are just a few other paintings from that period. And this particular piece is permanently resides in Hong Kong, as far as I know, as of right now. So a little bit more of a background to my work in terms of my installation practice and my sculptural work. I really, in grad school, I was interested in utopian ideas, but also dystopian ideas. I think that there's a yin and a yang to both of them. And if you start doing some research, you'll find that one can't exist without the other. But this is part of an architectonic gesture series. It consists of interlinking structures that explore the relationship between wall, ceiling, and floor, between psychic space and physical space. And this series encompasses three-dimensional landscapes that appear frozen in the midst of a chaotic event. I incorporate drawing and painting with different objects, igniting a play between the structure of the gallery and the theatrics of gesture and interplay of the painterly mark. A sense of theater is a formal extension of shadows cast by the gallery lights, the configuration of wall, ceiling, and intrinsic architectural nature of a given space. My work juxtaposes found objects, home building materials, architectural models, painterly abstract approaches to simplify or imply a shift between topography, natural disasters, and a tension between physical landscape and the landscape of the psyche. And in the course of doing this type of work, now that piece that you just saw, this one here, was from grad school, so circa 2009. You'll see my work slowly evolve. And in the course of that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've done process-wise and things that I constantly think about when installing. What you're looking at here is a piece that I've done 3 times, and then it just became so brittle it kind of fell apart. It had about 3 iterations. It's idea for rebuilding. So even though the work looks dystopian at times, there is a hint of a future. There is a hint of a past that you're seeing simultaneously. And I think that's some of the agency that the work can bring to the viewer. The piece on the left is, I think, the second iteration that I had of that. You're going to see a heavier influence of shadows and shadow play trying to form other structures. And the work on the right was the very last attempt at this model. It slowly started falling apart after this, but there was a hole that I actually put in the wall so the viewer could look through the wall to the other side where I had a joining installation. So I'm interested also at this point, I think 2011 is when the last version of this was done on the right. of allowing viewers to have these alternative experiences, to have different access points, and to have like a simultaneity of information. A little bit about my process. Coming from a background where I studied painting, and as a painter, I would mix all my colors first and have them on a palette in front of me so I could see everything that I'm working with. I kind of adopted that same process for installation. It's not always practical, and it gets me in trouble sometimes, but I find that it's how I work. You know, I'm formerly trained as a painter, uh, you know, an oil painter, an abstract painter, but also a figurative painter. Um, Coming into a different discipline, I kind of have to find a way to make it my own. So I might start with everything that I can collect around me, and for the work to truly be fresh and sort of be spontaneous, I use an ad hoc approach to picking items from a collection. And this allows me to have that instantaneous collage-like effect on the wall. And again, I think this is where my DJ practice really starts to connect with other parts of my work, because as a DJ, every single button that's in front of you can affect the music. So I see that there's a nice, again, a nice kinship between that. And this is the finished piece. So the before, which is total chaos, it's still chaos, but it's a little bit more ordered afterwards. Before I start an installation, I go through a series of drawings. And again, that drawing practice, the influence, the design, it's really important to me because I have great anxieties about things going wrong during the install. And they always have. And they, as much as you try to mitigate that, something always happens. Um, so I try to plan, I try to do these drawings, I try to do as much outside of the studio as possible. But there is a leap of faith and courage that comes to me right before I do an install. And this was from um, in these were preliminary drawings to an installation called Elastic Limits, which is this is the finished piece. It was at the Sculpture Center in 2011. I think the total length of this was somewhere around 65 feet, to give you a sense of scale. So a very large sense of scale, but the bulk of the installation on the right was about 50 feet in length. Um, and there were bits and pieces and shards of things that were sort of jammed into the wall and connected together. I remember there was a patron at the opening who came up to me and was very, very emotional and said, you know, this piece is difficult for me to look at. And I said, well, why? And he's like, well, when I was a young kid, my grandfather was in a tornado in the Midwest, and pieces and parts of the tornado were coming through the wall from his house in the same way that things were coming out of this wall. And it brought that particular viewer a sense of anxiety. And it was the first time that I really realized how much this type of work could impact the viewer. So I had to dial back some of my planning, some of my expectations, and the way that the way that this type of work affected people from time to time. But it just made me realize how much power physical installation and some of the content that can be wrapped up in this could really bring to someone. Moving forward a little bit, in 2013, this was a work that I did at the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland. I was invited to be in a show, a four-person show, and at that time, I was really interested in collaborating with other artists and collaging a little bit more with some of their stuffs as well. So I collected things from the other artists in the show. Um, in particular, you could see some like neon tubes up top. That was from the artist that was in the show, Jeff Chipless. There are these vinyl letters in there that were from an old Max and Irma's. That was from Dana Depew, and the other participant in the show was Elizabeth Emery. And there are pieces and parts of some stuff that I borrowed from her that are embedded in there. And I'm really interested in this multi-person collage. And again, going back to Schwitter's and thinking about some of the ways that he used found objects, collage material to Mertz to assemble to bring a different kind of voice to a collection of artworks. I'm still kind of practicing in that way and keeping that as a heartbeat of what I'm doing. But I'm also simultaneously very interested in shadow play. So some of the shadows that you're seeing that are thrown at the bottom of this installation are coming from like 4 or 5 different spotlights, all the way from maybe like a 6% dialed in spot to more of a flood. It allows me to, again, have that shadow play, enact that theater, and think about using light as drawing and the space of the wall as something more than just a holding place, but something as really like a playground or a new landscape. Shortly after this installation from Elastic Limits, I was invited to Denver, Colorado to have a small show. And the idea from this show comes out of a book called Constructions by John Rockman. And I was particularly drawn to this chapter called Other Geometries. And in that chapter, it discusses 2 kinds of spatial disposition, effective and affective. In short, I kind of interpreted the chapter as you can bring something to an artwork, you can bring something to a space, you can bring something to a place and time, AKA my painting on the left. And when you're around or involved in other stories or activities or influenced by other procedures, there's a shift in the way you think about geometry, the way you think about anything, and it can convert one thing into another. So I was interested in partnering with Denver artists and creating some new works. I brought a series of paintings, which you're about to see in the next couple slides, to Denver. And I said, I brought these paintings to these particular artists' studios. And I said, hey, do you have something in the studio that I could borrow to kind of like collaborate, if you will, and make this new, fresh piece that responds to this one that I brought? So these artists gifted me some stuff, random detritus or just leftovers from their studio. And I then created the piece on the right for each artist and gifted it back to them. So I basically collaged with their work, but I displayed it as a call and response, if you will, or another geometry. And those are a few pieces from that show. The series Other Geometries is, in my head, it's still ongoing. I've done a couple iterations of this. I'm waiting for the prime time to potentially do this with either Cleveland artists or other Ohio artists or other artists nationally. But it takes a lot of energy because it's kind of like, it's really invested in what's happening in their practice and what's happening in their space. So if there's anybody out there that wants to be a candidate, I will definitely enjoy that conversation. In 2017, I was invited by the curator Richard Fletcher to make a piece or have a dialogue with the show that he was curating for the Rife Gallery, of course. And these are some preliminary drawings I did for this piece called Cardinal that I created on site in the space. And again, drawing for me has been a way of finding certainty, confidence, or direction in the work. it's a way of casting or forecasting a deliverable, and working with a curator, because sometimes when I make my wacky installations, curators get really nervous. And they're worried about the wall. They're worried about the amount of stuff that I bring to the space. So this I found is a way for me to give them a little bit more certainty and also help with the planning process. And now that I've been working in interior design for a little bit, again, that's very, very similar to what we do in this field. But this particular piece was also an homage to a cardinal. When the curator came to my studio to visit and talk about my work and what I can contribute to the show, unfortunately, a cardinal flew into one of my large windows and oops, sorry about that. Um, Unfortunately, passed away. So I very, very carefully took care of that, but I saved one little feather from the cardinal and used that as a memorial piece, uh, or created kind of a memorial piece inside the installation. And then, of course, gifted that back to the curator. There is an image of the total installation. So you can see my preliminary drawings to the left and to the right. And in the center, I don't have a cursor to show you, but to the left of that giant blue piece that says tougher, it's from an insulation, there's the little feather embedded in there. I kind of see it as a homage to maybe the last few things that the cardinal saw in his heroic flight, that maybe life was passing him by in such a grand way and he just like seen a little bit of everything in the world. um I mean, it it's chaotic, but it's beautiful at the same time, and there's this tension between the space when you're physically viewing something like this, but the metaphor of maybe what happened for that particular cardinal. And just to read you a quick quote, architecture can arrest transient and timid inclinations, amplify and solidify them, and thereby grant us more permanent access to a range of emotional textures, which we might otherwise have experienced only accidentally and occasionally. And this is from The Architecture of Happiness, one book that was, again, very influential to me by Alain de Botton. I see this idea of architecture as granting access to emotional textures as a really interesting idea. And I bring that up in relationship to this work. This is from a two-person show that I did in Michigan called Hypothetical Constructs and Translucent Boundaries, excuse me. This was with a Cleveland artist. His name's Andy Curlow. He also shows in Canada as well. But we both kind of explored the ideas of translucent boundaries and constructs in different ways. But what you're seeing in the bottom image here is a view when you first walk into the gallery. So there, it looks like just one giant installation, but in fact, there's two. So sometimes when you're really close to a situation, you just see everything all at once and it becomes overwhelming, it becomes daunting, it becomes too much. But sometimes when you have a different perspective on things and you get the right angle, you get the right kind of viewpoint, you can see that things aren't as complex as they originally were. And there's a way to separate them and create a different kind of emotional texture. And I think that that quote by in the previous slide and this piece have a lot in common in that sense. This is currents from that show. This is a better view of currents. It's the piece on the back wall there. And I had one more installation in this particular show, but I left it out of this lecture because I could be long-winded. Thinking about structural parameters and giving myself permissions and also activating space and thinking about site specificity. This particular piece is called Fragmented. It was constructed for a faculty show at the University of Akron in the Myers School of Art. I worked there for a while, and I think it was up until 2022, 23, that I was teaching there in design and also drawing. But this particular piece has a hole that goes through the wall, but there's a mirror on the other side. So the way that the gallery is constructed, it's got an upper and a lower level. So as you're walking from the upper level down to the lower level, there's stairs, and right at the foot of the stairs, there is this wall, which you would encounter the piece on the left. And you'll probably notice something moving or shining in there, and that is the mirror echoing the rest of the space. So I wanted to grant viewers access to the rest of the faculty artwork in the show so that my work would be kind of like an invitation or include some of that viewpoint. In a way, this is very site specific because it granted a certain kind of access to the rest of the space. And thinking about the inherent architectural parameters of viewpoint, angle, access to other colors, and maybe metaphors and ideas has been something that's really important to my work. Also, with this particular piece that was done in Bay Village, Ohio, I was thinking a lot about site specificity and working with existing architectural parameters in the space. You can see that there's holes in the ceiling. This room, which is now a gallery space, was an old playhouse. And when I got the plan for figuring out how I was going to install not only this installation, but this was actually a show that was a hybrid show with my paintings and my installation work. These holes in the ceiling were so dominant. I had to work with them in some way. So I built these structures that were ceiling dominant coming down. And this was the first time that I worked instead of with the wall or with the floor, with the ceiling primarily holding my work. So the holes were in the Fibonacci sequence, which I thought was really, really apropos for dealing with architecture. But it was also, a structural challenge because I had to actually create these welded structures and then design all my constructions within and around these welded structures. So definitely a different architectural construction challenge within the space. One of the things that I failed to mention so far is I'll have hours or days to create these on site. And this particular piece was created in 3 days. So maybe 6 to 8 hours a day over the course of 3 days. And you'll see in some of my detail shots in the top right, there's a little house in the background. That is a replica of the Sullivan House. This gallery in particular it's called the Sullivan House, but it was actually floated down Lake Erie and then hoisted up onto Huntington Beach in Bay Village in halves. And when I saw the original images of the house coming in, I was like, oh, I want to do something with that experience and that site. So I built half the house coming out the wall, which I thought was kind of funny, but interesting at the same time. So I think it's right around this work in 2018 where some of the humor in my life and in the work starts to come out a little bit more. Also thinking about shadow play, I've talked about it a little bit, but I really want to hone in on one specific thing that I'm interested in this idea of shadow play and using shadows as drawing. This small piece is called Artist House. It was built in 2015, so going back a few years for a show in a place called Hinterland in Denver. And I had like 5 or 6 days to build the show. I came to Denver with a car full of stuff, architectural models, most of which I had to rearrange on site. And there were a lot of challenges, exciting challenges in the space, but there's a little architectural studio in this particular house that's coming off the wall, and the shadow creates almost a piano and a special light. So I'm interested in the shift of meaning and interpretation and metaphor that happens when you see one thing, but you're kind of caught off guard by something else. And maybe it's my ADHD coming out in my artwork, I don't know, but there's this real beauty and this poetry that happens because of those two moments together. Also in 2018, I was invited to create a work at American Greetings, Gallery W in Westlake, Ohio. Um, it was myself and another artist, another really well-known Cleveland artist. But they were really interested in me doing one of my installations. So this was really the first time that I took probably, well, not probably, but I took my drawing process a lot more seriously because I had to communicate with a gallery director and architects and have a really, really solid plan before I came into the space. And they also were kind enough to gift me some vinyl portions of this. So I came into this installation process with having all of the color field done. That's you could see in the background. And by the way, the house on the right was existing there. I just actually painted the whole thing and freestyled that shape that's kind of in there. So I planned all of the color portions of this out and then built the architectonics and modular structures on top of it. This was a shift in my work in terms of color, in terms of scale. The total scale of this is quite large if you look at the annotations on the right. But once I got there and I had all my color and the scale, they said, well, we can't do all the vinyl. We can only do a little. And I was like, well, can you do the shiny stuff? Because that's the really cool stuff. Can you do the stuff that kind of looks Baroque? And they helped me out with that. And I was very grateful for that. So I had to freehand the rest of it. So I got really, really good at doing freehand wall scale painting. And I think it turned out pretty nice. Some of the elements in here I should also mention, again, I'm still working with found elements. I'm still working with these architectonic like modular structures. They're, now that I've been teaching for a while, I can say with certainty they go from 3/4 scale or 1-to-1 scale all the way down to 1/4 inch scale. So playing with these scales to shift this sort of psychological viewing space. The artist that I was showing with in this particular show, Corey Slauson, who creates work that deals with artifice and beauty and sort of this historical context of, at the time she was dealing with the historical context of um, uh, a lot of different hierarchies, like Baroque versus Rococo versus stylistic beauty things. So there's a lot of style shift in here as well. So I try to kind of work with some of the energies of collaborators when I have that opportunity. And you can see some other views of pieces and parts of this installation. So just to give a little context, around this time, I'm still painting, but I'm still making these crazy wild installations. And 2018 was a crazy year for me. I think I had like 16 shows that year, which is a lot. For those of you who are watching this or will watch this later, I think that, just a couple of shows as an artist in one year is a lot, but 16 is a really lot. And I was thinking about a lot of what I was doing in my installations. I had hours, I had days to create that work. And then I just had to like go back to a practice that brought me solace and kind of calmed me down, that muted my anxiety a little bit. So I started changing and shifting things a little bit and playing around with patches of different moments, like I kind of did in the installations. And again, this year was a monumental year for me, but thinking about how to convey ideas or plan a little bit better, or think about series, or think about a new series. And these are some preliminary drawings that are mixed media and gouache on paper. So you'll see bits of paper, you'll see bits of architectural material, some hot glue, some paint, a little of this, a little of that. So my drawing and painting skills are merged in with this, and these kind of forecast some physical structures that I made. I've done about 6 of these, and one of them is currently in the In Ohio show that's on view at the Rife Gallery. This is Stack Structures number 2. And really these are um, part of a larger investigation that explores architecture of or international architects who've been designing to address space constraints, refocusing design of living environment to create a sense of community and reduce the environmental footprint. So my investigation pursues these questions only in theory by using ad hoc assemblage to investigate questions surrounding climate change, postmodern architecture, modular structure, again, psychological spaces. So how do we build up, but use what we have to not to like cut down on waste and cut down on overuse, think smarter, build better. All these questions, they're still circulating quite a bit with architects all over the world. Um, Again, going forward, I'm making these structures and I'm painting at the same time. I think both practices kind of are starting to really inform one another around 2020. And you'll notice a grand shift in my paintings from about 2020 onwards. And I went through a pretty intense personal situation. And that I think liberated my palette and gave me some freedoms to a certain extent. Um, so right around 2020, 2021, again, I'm still working with structure, still working in the painting studio, but this particular piece, Lockdown Breakout, what happened around that time is also the pandemic. And this piece is currently, again, on view in the Rife Gallery, but I'm thinking a lot about kind of be describing the spaces within these structures a little bit more. I reenacted a portion of my studio in one of the spaces. Again, my love for DJing, DJ culture is I have a small little DJ studio in there. I have an architectural studio in there. I have a dance studio in there. Um, it's kind of autobiographical in a way, but I also think that this is what happened to a lot of us during COVID, right? We went into our hobbies, we went into our minds, we went into our personal spaces, and we did everything that we could to amplify that. You know, TikTok, Instagram Reels, all of that became an extension of our house. So it's like these spaces are with us everywhere we go. So I was interested in really making a work that kind of connected with that time. In 2021, I was also very, very fortunate to have been invited to show with a gallery that I really love in Denver, Colorado, called Space Gallery. And this is part of a series of work that I did for my first big show out there. Um, it uses pieces and parts of folded architecture and digital processes. Around this time, my my work, again, it shifted in terms of color palette, but it also shifted a lot in terms of how I was dealing with painting space. And I think I just really got into some of the things that were happening for me in my installation practice and then my paintings as well. I should say, as kind of like a side note to these paintings, I was temporarily enrolled in a master's program in visual communication design, and I had the seminar class during that time where they just, the professor asked us for a weekend, can you draw a map of your process? Or can you, like, give an infographic of your process? And I was like, oh, this sounds like a great challenge. Which process shall I pick? So I picked all of them. And then once I did that grid, I realized that there was a connection. And I used that connection as the new recipe for making work. So although I didn't continue, sadly, in that program because it just became a little overwhelming for me, it gave me this wonderful sense of permission to access something in my work that I hadn't before. And I say that in relationship to maybe how these are looking a little bit more utopian or a little bit more like fresh rendered architecture, or they reference fresh renderings of architecture, is because I'm taking the 3D process. So the way that these are kind of constructed is I'll make models, and then I'll take those models and digitize them into programs like Illustrator, Photoshop, or other 3D model making programs. And then I'll start to add some color. And then once I do that, I'll begin a painting or a series of paintings. And then I'll have maybe a couple of minutes to figure out the gesture. So for me, this process is really, really carefully building and planning and thinking about the right structure and the right gesture and the right time. And these are a little bit more recent, 2023. And you'll notice some of the titles for these. I'm going to just go back a few slides. The Tipping Point, Tears for Fears. I went to go see them live at Blossom. Absolutely love the band. Super inspired by that album. I love, love, love the band Everything But the Girl. Big fan of their album Temperamental. So music follows me still to this day. And of course, Le Nuit's Nightmares on Wax. I'm a huge fan. This goes back to the 90s, Nightmares on Wax. So thinking about space, time, movement, dance, the body, how human movement and constructed spaces can coexist. And I think that relates a lot to my practice as also teaching interior design. This was from a two-person show I had with Cleveland artist Patty Flauto. And the reason why I wanted to include this into the lecture today is because I've been talking a lot about my installation work and practice and my painting practice, but I think that the structure of this kind of reaches in to connect some of these two practices a little bit more carefully. So you'll see the first row on the left is actually Patty's work. The second row is mine, and you'll see that the structure looks a little awkward, and it's because that canvas is actually shaped at a strange angle. Originally, the way these were displayed was on a wall that kind of raised out towards a column that was in the middle. This is the second iteration of a display, which is on permanent collection. But the original, everything was kind of coming to this column space. So I designed the my portion of the paintings, which are again the second row, the fourth row, and the sixth row, to kind of come up to that pinnacle space. An interesting fact about this, I didn't know exactly how Patty's work looked. I kind of had like just a small little Photoshop rendering, and I just kind of went in and did the other paintings, again, ad hoc, wild and wacky, and I just went for it. I know we're getting short on time, but bear with me a few more minutes. So I'm just going to show you some more recent works and kind of where I am right now. The work in this collection that you're seeing here is based on music and DJ culture, or four to the floor, and electronic music that was born in the late 70s, disco, to mid 80s, new wave. Over the last couple of years, my artwork has drifted into this new series titled Geometric Gestures. It's a fusion between geometric spaces, gestural movements created with dance and rhythm. So I'm interested in movement, space, light, and time, again, as it pertains to the human experience. This work, for me, also celebrates unity, diversity, love, and life in the most surreal yet elegant way possible. A music that inspires this type of work is about bringing people together, overcoming differences, and finding a voice to communicate and really figure out where love lives. So thus the title of this. And these are a couple more pieces from that series. And at the very end of 2024, I created a couple small ones within this series, but I haven't gone back to that. I'm kind of back and forth between different series right now, so definitely looking forward to reinvestigating this summer. So thinking about movement and things that relate to architecture, thinking about experiences and things that are prevalent in our daily color palette, or things that are maybe a meditation on world events. This particular piece is called United, and I've been thinking a lot about the war in Ukraine and things that are happening in Europe. And also another series that I've been working on is called Sightless. This is from the book on architecture called Sightless, and it's just a collection of these small pieces right now. They're taking these modular forms, but I'm actually giving them a backdrop and sort of a character animation using my gesture and my color palette, which doesn't exist in the original forms. But it's just a playful way for me to kind of expand my painting experience. So I want to thank everybody for listening to my talk today, experiencing my work with me. And I want to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at Jenniffer Omaitz, my website, omaitz.com. I'm also a professional marbler and bookmaker, and you can view that at jcmarbling.shop. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenniffer. Folks, if you have questions, pop them into the chat. But in the meantime, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your training. So you mentioned briefly that figurative work is a constant for you, and I'm curious what you think about traditional art training as important, or how does it affect your practice as an abstract artist?
I think that formal training is necessary and excellent, and I encourage everybody to take classes, or if you can afford it, definitely go to art school. Um, so a little bit about my particular training, and it's kind of a two-part story. I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art for undergrad, and as someone who chose painting as their major, we had to take 5 years of figure drawing. Uh, that was built into the structure of our program. We had no choice. And then I, took a few years off and went to grad school, and that was part of what I had to start teaching. So essentially, I've been drawing the figure since I was about 16, because I was a little advanced when I was in high school, so I started taking classes, figure drawing classes, very, very early. So I've had this sort of lifetime of figure drawing, and I've taught it for the duration of my teaching career so far. But I've chosen not to paint or draw or specifically use the figure, and part of that reason, it's a personal reason, but I grew up in a beauty shop. So I grew up watching people become transformed in front of me, either through my mom doing their hair or other hairdressers working with them. And of course, when you're in the chair in a beauty shop, you dive into your whole story. So I got to hear everybody's kind of baggage or psychology. And I started drawing the figure, I started drawing all these women in the chair at a very young age. And that was enough for me. Like, I felt like I got what I needed from that experience growing up and just learning about figurative drawing. Like, that seemed to feed me. Um, but that's just my personal experience. That's not the case for everyone. But I think that having something that's a a formative, very bold, or life-changing experience that deals with the figure gives you a place of stance, or it gives you kind of like a place to springboard off of.
Well, I mean, I also see within this work, like that we're looking up at right now, you know how to describe form within space. And so I think that's also a really important component of it to recognize that it is there, that training and then the quote unquote breaking of the rules. So I'd love for you to chat a little bit more about the kind of dance that you have in your work between what feels really rigid and super planned and what feels really organic. Would you mind?
Sure, I'm gonna go back a few slides if that's okay, to some of this work. Um, so when I started doing these, or even before I started doing these, um, I would do these quick little works on paper that had this leftover paint or just like gesture squish on there. And I love the way that looked, but it also comes from that quick gesture comes from the practice of being a professional marbler. We have seconds to take a rake through a bath. So if you don't know what marbling is, it's water that's dropped on so there's a bath, or like an aluminum bath of thickened water in there, usually with carrageenan or methylcellulose, and you drop different kinds of watercolor on there, and then you can rake it through or draw with it on the surface or create patterns and designs. But it happens relatively quickly. But you have to have a steady hand and a steady mind. So I think that practice definitely informs this a little bit, this sort of shapes in the background. So that human movements, that gesture movements, kind of play into this. And I don't know, I really loved the works of Deborah Zlotsky, who I think still teaches at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. And I remember her works in like the late 90s, early 2000s had these like architectonicness to them. And I remember the experience of seeing those works in person and being really impacted by them. And I also kind of like this quick handmade, hand marked element into the space. And it's, jamming them together has been weird, but kind of different and awkward. And I see a connection with these things that I like and the music that I like to listen to. And I hope I answered that question, but I kind of see them just, I don't know, coexisting in this weird way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you did talking about the mechanical versus the hand. It's
Yeah.
great. Um, so what I know that you mentioned the experimental film was really impactful for your kind of divergence into um, this kind of work. And I'm curious, like, did you have that realization and then just go, headlong into it, or had you dabbled and come through? And can you help the reason I ask this question is, many folks are curious about how they might dip their toe into abstraction. Um, and I think it's important to kind of give context to how it happens for different artists.
Yeah, I think in part of that is getting into abstraction. I tried everything when I was an undergrad. I I had a so CIA at the time was a 5-year school, and not many art schools were 5 years. And the first 2 years were this really, really heavy foundation program where you had steadfast design classes and drawing classes and painting classes and art history classes, and which remapped your brain completely with art history, um, and writing classes. And each of those classes, with the exception of the academics, was a full day. So I feel like diving into these different practices for one solid day at a time allowed me to experience different things. And of course, I would take more niche classes outside of that. And I just realized that at that time when I was in art school, you just try everything until something sticks. And then sometimes those things that stick, like my interest in film or my interest in 2D versus 3D, um, really become finding solutions or finding ways to solve problems, I guess. I know I'm talking about this in a really, really funny way, but I don't know. There was something that I really loved about experimental cinema. And to go back to that work a little bit, before I even went to art school, I should say that I was a laser light operator for underground parties, commonly known as raves. And that experience that dealt with light, space, and time, that dealt with graphics in an interior environment, really had an impact on me. And I loved that experience. Of course, anybody who's been to a light show or a really nice EDM party understands what I'm talking about. But there's something magical and really beautiful about that moment of light on a surface or light in a space. And for me, experimental cinema was close to that experience, but in a really formal way. And I think that I'm like with every painting in some way, shape, or form, I'm trying to capture that. Um, and I'm glad that I'm still trying to capture that. There's questions that I have that I don't have answers to, which is why I keep painting. Um, but I think abstraction in general is it's a play, it's a game, it's like chess for me. I thoroughly enjoy it, and yeah, I just keep chasing it.
I love that. I think that's a perfect place for us to wrap up. Jenniffer, thank you again for the generosity of your time and talent. And thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Jenniffer Omaitz as a part of our programming for In Ohio. I'd like to give a special thank you to the curator, Char Norman, a big thank you to all the other participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor, who all support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.